Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of language learners struggle with,
Yeah,
and that is how to actually think in English, not
absolutely.
just translate everything in your head.
It's the goal.
So we're going to be looking at an episode from a popular English learning podcast and kind of pulling out some of their top tips and tricks
Yeah.
and, hopefully actionable things that our listeners can start doing right away
Yeah, I love that.
to kind of break free of that translation trap.
That's a great way to put it, a translation trap, because you're right. It can feel like you're just stuck.
Yeah, you're constantly going back and forth, and it's exhausting.
It's exhausting.
Right.
And it really slows you down.
Yeah.
Like when you're trying to have a conversation, it's like, oh, wait, let me translate that in my head. Hold
Yeah.
on. And by that time, the conversation has moved on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the podcast we're looking at today suggests starting with really simple everyday phrases like, this is my coffee, or I'm going to work, very basic things.
Right.
Is there a reason why they suggest starting with those basic phrases?
Well, it's a great question. And I think the reason why is that it helps to build what we call procedural memory.
Procedural memory.
So think about the things that you do every day.
Okay.
You brush your teeth, you make your coffee, you get dressed.
Yeah.
These are all things that you do automatically without even thinking about it.
I mean, sometimes I forget to brush my teeth.
Yeah.
But,
Okay, well, hopefully you remember most of the time.
most of the time, yeah.
But the point is that these actions become automatic because we've done them so many times that we've built up this procedural memory.
Right.
And the same thing can happen with language.
Okay.
So when we start with these simple everyday phrases and we consciously link them to the actions that we're doing, we start to build up that same kind of procedural memory for English.
I see. I see.
So instead of having to translate everything in our head all the time, it starts to become more automatic.
So it's not just about learning the phrases, but like actually saying them
Yeah.
while you're doing those things.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about connecting the language to the action and making it a part of your daily routine.
Okay, interesting.
So the podcast also talked about narrating your daily activities in English.
Yeah, so like literally just like talking to yourself.
Yeah, basically. And I know it might sound a little strange at first,
Yeah.
but it's actually a really effective way to practice.
Is this also related to this procedural memory then?
It's like a form of active internalization.
Active internalization. Okay.
So instead of passively translating, you're actively using English to describe what you're doing.
I see. So I'm like forcing my brain to kind of work through those processes.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated.
Yeah.
You can just start with simple things like,
Yeah.
I'm making breakfast.
Yeah.
I'm putting on my shoes.
Yeah.
I'm walking to the bus stop.
Right.
Just little things like that. And over time, it will start to feel more and more natural.
So this podcast really emphasizes immersion as well.
Yes.
Like a lot of resources do.
Yeah.
They suggest things like using flashcards and language learning apps and even changing your phone's language to English.
It's a big one.
Is there anything else about immersion that they talk about?
Well, they talk about something called input flooding,
Input flooding.
which is basically the idea that you want to surround yourself with as much English as possible.
Okay. Even if it's just for like short periods of time.
Exactly. So even if you can only spare 15 minutes a day to watch an English TV show or listen to an English podcast,
Right.
that's better than nothing.
So it's really about quality and quantity then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about getting as much exposure to the language as possible.
So with things like flashcards,
Yeah.
I've used flashcards, and I feel like I struggle with actually remembering the words.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips for using flashcards effectively?
I do. Yeah. One of the best tips is to use active recall.
Active recall.
So instead of just passively flipping through the cards, try to actively recall the meaning of the word
Before I flip it over.
before you flip it over exactly. So
Right.
you look at the word and you say, okay, what does this word mean? And then you flip it over and see if you're right.
And if I'm wrong.
And if you're wrong, that's okay. It just means that you need to study that word a little bit more.
Right. Okay.
Another important tip is to use spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition.
So this is the idea that you want to review the words at increasing intervals.
Okay.
So you might review a word today, and then again tomorrow, and then again in 3 days, and then again in a week.
Okay.
And this helps to really cement the word in your long-term memory.
So it's kind of like tricking my brain into thinking that I might forget it.
Exactly. So it holds on to it tighter.
Okay. I like that active recall.
Yeah.
Another thing that the podcast talks about is practicing these small conversations in your head.
Oh, yeah.
Like imagining you're ordering food or asking for directions.
Right.
How does that help?
Well, think of it like this. Imagine you're an athlete
Yeah.
and you're training for a competition.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just show up on the day of the competition and expect to perform perfectly, would you?
No.
You would have spent weeks and months practicing and training and preparing.
Right.
And it's the same thing with language.
Okay, so this is like my training then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
These little conversations that you practice in your head
Right.
are like your training sessions.
Okay, I like that.
They help you to build fluency and confidence so that when you're in a real conversation, you're not caught off guard.
Like I already have that information.
Exactly.
Thank you.
You've already pre-programmed those responses.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then they also talk about active listening and reading.
Yes.
So they suggest that instead of just passively listening or reading,
Mm-hmm.
that we should try to repeat phrases out loud and
Right.
summarize what we've learned.
It's really important.
Is that really more effective than just kind of passively absorbing it?
It is. And here's why. Think of your brain like a muscle.
Yeah.
When you passively listen or read, it's like watching someone else lift weights.
Okay.
You might get a sense of how it's done,
Yeah.
but you're not actually building any strength yourself.
Right.
But when you actively engage with the material, when you repeat phrases out loud, when you summarize what you've learned,
Right.
it's like doing the reps yourself.
I see. So I'm actually building up those muscles.
Exactly. You're actively processing the language.
Yeah.
You're reinforcing your understanding and you're improving your recall.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then the podcast ends with this reminder to just be patient
Yes.
and to celebrate those small wins.
So important.
No, and I think that's really important because language learning can be a long and challenging journey.
It can be.
And it's easy to get discouraged if you're not seeing results right away.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's so important to acknowledge those milestones, no matter how small,
Okay.
because it helps to maintain motivation and it reinforces the feeling of progress.
Yeah, like I did something,
Exactly.
even if it was small.
And it's also important to remember that mistakes are inevitable. You're going to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes.
Yeah.
But the key is to not let those mistakes discourage you. They're actually valuable opportunities to learn and grow.
But I like that reframing of it. Instead of being afraid to make mistakes,
Uh-huh.
thinking of them as learning experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So embrace those mistakes, learn from them, and move on.
I love all these tips. I'm excited to start incorporating them myself.
Yeah, me too.
I think I've kind of been falling into that translation trap a little bit.
It happens. It happens to the best of us.
But this is really encouraging.
Good.
So I guess for our listeners out there,
Yeah.
what would you recommend for them to start with?
I would say just pick one or two of these tips that really resonated with you
Okay.
and start incorporating them into your language learning routine. You don't have to do everything at once.
Right.
Just start small and gradually build up from there.
Awesome. Well, this is a great deep dive. Super insightful. I think I learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners did too.
I hope so.
So to wrap things up, I want to leave you with one question. What small victory in your English learning journey are you going to celebrate?
Ooh, I like that.
Keep that in mind. Stay persistent, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.